What started as a normal daytime conversation quickly turned into a moment no one in the studio expected. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, and a guest who's usually reserved and diplomatic decides to speak more directly than anyone was expecting? Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The segment in question took place during a regular weekday episode of a popular U.S. daytime talk show, one known for balancing celebrity interviews with social and political discussions that often drift into personal territory. On this particular morning, the show opened as it usually does, with casual banter between the hosts and a brief rundown of the day's topics. There was nothing in the first few minutes to suggest that anything unusual was about to happen. Jeremy Renner had been invited on to promote a new project and to talk about how his perspective on life had changed over the past couple of years. The tone was initially light and respectful. Renner entered the set to applause, exchanged greetings with the panel, and took his seat. His body language was relaxed, and he appeared comfortable, smiling and making small jokes as the hosts welcomed him. The conversation began in a familiar way, focusing on his career, recent work, and how he balances acting with family life. The hosts asked about upcoming films, his recovery from past injuries, and how he's adjusted to a slower pace in certain areas of his life. Renner responded calmly, speaking thoughtfully and without much hesitation. It was the kind of interview viewers of daytime television have seen hundreds of times. Joy Behar, known for steering conversations toward broader cultural and social topics, eventually shifted the discussion. She acknowledged Renner's personal experiences and then pivoted toward a more general issue about responsibility, public influence, and how celebrities use their platforms. At first, her question sounded neutral, framed as a way to connect his story to a larger conversation happening in the media. She asked him how he feels about public figures speaking out on social issues, especially when their opinions may differ from mainstream narratives or from what audiences expect. Renner paused briefly before answering, which was the first subtle sign that the conversation was moving into more sensitive territory. He didn't immediately jump in with a rehearsed response. Instead, he seemed to consider his words carefully. He replied that he believes everyone has the right to their own opinions, but that he personally prefers to focus on his work and his personal life rather than becoming part of constant public debates. He said that while he respects people who use their voice for advocacy, he doesn't think it should be expected of every actor or celebrity. Joy followed up, gently but persistently, suggesting that in today's climate, silence can sometimes be interpreted as taking a position in itself. Her tone wasn't aggressive, but it carried an underlying implication that public figures have a responsibility to engage, whether they want to or not. At this point, Renner's posture shifted slightly. He leaned forward in his chair and folded his hands together, a common sign that he was preparing to speak more seriously. His expression remained calm, but the casual smile from earlier in the interview faded. He responded by saying that he understands that perspective, but he doesn't fully agree with it. He explained that he feels there's a growing pressure on people in the public eye to constantly comment on issues they may not feel fully informed about, and that this can sometimes do more harm than good. He emphasized that he values thoughtful conversation over reactive commentary. The studio remained quiet as he spoke, with the other hosts listening closely. The audience, which had been reacting with laughter and applause earlier, now seemed more subdued. This was no longer a promotional interview. It had shifted into something more reflective and potentially uncomfortable. Joy then challenged his point, saying that when someone has a large platform, choosing not to speak can feel like avoiding accountability. She framed it as a moral question, not a personal attack, but the implication was clear. She was pushing him to acknowledge that influence comes with responsibility. Renner didn't raise his voice or show visible frustration, but his response became more direct. He said that accountability also means being honest about what you don't know and recognizing when it's better to listen rather than speak. He added that he doesn't believe in performing opinions just to meet public expectations. This was the moment where the tone of the exchange noticeably changed. It wasn't heated, but it was no longer purely friendly. There was a subtle tension in the way they addressed each other, a careful balance between politeness and disagreement. Joy, sensing that the conversation had taken on a more serious edge, tried to clarify her point. She said she wasn't suggesting that everyone should comment on everything, but that certain issues are so important that staying neutral can feel inadequate. She asked Renner whether he thinks celebrities have a role in shaping public discourse. Renner took another pause, longer this time. He looked briefly toward the other hosts, then back at Joy. His voice remained steady, but there was a noticeable firmness in his tone. He said that he believes celebrities can contribute to conversations, but they shouldn't be treated as authorities just because they're famous. He pointed out that expertise and lived experience matter more than visibility, and that sometimes the public places too much weight on celebrity opinions instead of listening to people directly affected by the issues. One of the co-hosts nodded slightly, as if acknowledging his point. Another attempted to soften the atmosphere by adding a comment about how complicated these discussions have become in the age of social media, where every statement is instantly analyzed and amplified. The audience responded with light applause, signaling that they were engaged and following the exchange closely. It wasn't an argument in the traditional sense, but it was clearly a disagreement unfolding in real time, with both sides standing by their perspectives. Joy then asked a more personal question, bringing the conversation back to Renner's own experiences. She suggested that given what he's been through, his voice might carry a different kind of weight, one rooted in resilience and recovery. She asked whether that changes how he sees his role in public discussions. Renner acknowledged her point, but reiterated that he prefers to share personal insights rather than political or social commentary. He said that his story is about healing and perspective, and that he doesn't want it to be used as a platform for broader debates that he doesn't feel qualified to lead. At this stage, the tension wasn't overt, but it was clearly present. The conversation had slowed down, with longer pauses between questions and answers. The hosts were choosing their words more carefully, and Renner's responses were measured and deliberate. Joy made one final remark that subtly pushed back again, suggesting that sometimes personal stories naturally become part of larger cultural conversations, whether someone intends it or not. Her tone was still conversational, but there was an underlying insistence. Renner, without interrupting her, waited until she finished speaking. Then he calmly said that while he understands that perspective, he believes it's important to set boundaries around what one is willing to discuss publicly. He said that not every experience has to be framed as a statement, and that sometimes it's okay to simply share without turning it into a message. The studio audience reacted with a mix of applause and murmurs, reflecting the divided nature of the topic. Some seemed to agree with Joy's viewpoint, while others appeared to resonate with Renner's emphasis on boundaries and authenticity. The exchange ended without any dramatic conclusion, but the atmosphere in the studio had noticeably shifted. What started as a routine interview had evolved into a thoughtful, slightly tense discussion about influence, responsibility, and the role of public figures in modern discourse. As the show transitioned to the next topic, there was a brief moment of lighter conversation, almost as if the hosts were intentionally easing the mood. But for viewers watching live, the moment between Renner and Joy stood out as the most memorable part of the segment, not because it was explosive, but because it felt real, unscripted, and reflective of conversations happening far beyond the studio. As the show moved forward, the hosts briefly shifted to another topic, but the energy in the room hadn't fully reset. There was a noticeable change in the rhythm of the conversation, the kind that regular viewers of daytime television can sense even when no one explicitly points it out. The panelists were still smiling, still professional, but the earlier ease had been replaced by a more careful, deliberate tone. When the discussion circled back to Jeremy Renner, it wasn't framed as a continuation of the disagreement, but it naturally picked up where things had left off. One of the other hosts gently referenced what had just been said, commenting on how difficult it can be for public figures to navigate expectations in today's media environment. This was said in a neutral way, almost as a bridge between perspectives rather than a challenge to either side. Renner nodded in agreement, acknowledging that the situation is complex. He said that he doesn't think there's a simple answer, and that everyone has to figure out what feels authentic for them. His voice was calm, but there was still a sense that he was being more thoughtful and guarded than he had been earlier in the segment. Joy listened closely, her body language shifting slightly. She leaned back in her chair, arms resting on the table, and her expression softened. When she spoke again, her tone was less pointed and more reflective. She said that she understands the desire for boundaries, especially given how intense public scrutiny can be. But she also admitted that she sometimes worries about what happens when influential voices choose not to engage at all. This time, Renner didn't respond immediately. There was a short pause, one that felt longer on live television than it probably was in reality. He took a breath and then said that he thinks there's a difference between choosing not to engage and choosing how to engage. He explained that for him, meaningful conversations often happen privately or in smaller spaces, not necessarily on national television. The audience reacted with a low murmur, the kind that signals interest rather than approval or disagreement. It was clear that viewers were processing what was being said rather than waiting for a punchline or a dramatic moment. Joy then asked a question that brought the conversation slightly closer to personal territory again. She wondered aloud whether Renner ever feels pressure from fans or the industry to speak out more, especially given his visibility and the loyalty of his audience. Renner admitted that he does feel that pressure, but he said it doesn't always come from a place of understanding. He explained that people often project their own expectations onto public figures, assuming that fame automatically equals authority or obligation. He said that while he appreciates the support of his fans, he doesn't want to mislead them by pretending to have answers he doesn't truly have. One of the other hosts added that this is a common issue across the entertainment industry, where actors, musicians, and athletes are often expected to comment on topics far outside their professional expertise. She said that this can create a cycle where people speak just to avoid criticism, rather than because they genuinely feel informed or passionate about an issue. Joy responded by saying that she agrees, but she also pointed out that some of the most impactful social changes in recent years have been supported by well-known figures who use their platforms to amplify certain messages. She wasn't arguing against Renner specifically, but she was clearly trying to reframe the discussion in a way that emphasized the potential positive side of public engagement. Renner acknowledged that point without resistance. He said that he respects people who choose to use their influence that way, and that he's grateful when celebrities bring attention to important causes. However, he reiterated that he doesn't think there should be a universal expectation that everyone must do the same. The tension at this stage wasn't confrontational, but it was steady. It felt like two people who fundamentally see the issue from different angles, both speaking calmly but firmly about their beliefs. Joy then made a comment that subtly shifted the dynamic again. She said that sometimes, when people avoid public discussions, it can be interpreted as fear of backlash rather than a thoughtful choice. She asked Renner whether criticism plays a role in his decision to stay out of certain conversations. Renner smiled slightly at this, but it was a restrained smile, not the relaxed one from earlier. He said that criticism is part of being in the public eye, and that he's learned to accept it over time. However, he added that his decision isn't about fear, but about responsibility to himself and to the people who listen to him. He said that speaking just to fill space doesn't feel responsible to him. The studio audience responded with light applause, suggesting that many viewers resonated with that idea. The mood in the room felt thoughtful rather than divided, even though the disagreement was still present beneath the surface. Joy took a moment before responding again. When she did, her voice was quieter and more reflective. She said that she appreciates his honesty and that she doesn't think there's anything wrong with choosing a more personal path. She admitted that her own perspective is shaped by years of being in media and feeling a constant urge to comment on current events. This was the first moment where the conversation felt less like a debate and more like a mutual exchange of experiences. Renner nodded and said that he thinks that's part of what makes these discussions so complicated. Different roles come with different expectations, and what feels natural for one person might feel forced for another. Another host stepped in to summarize the exchange, saying that it highlights a broader cultural question about where responsibility truly lies with individuals, institutions, or audiences themselves. She suggested that perhaps the pressure placed on celebrities is a reflection of a deeper desire for guidance in an uncertain world. Renner agreed with that interpretation, adding that people often look to familiar faces because they feel accessible and human. He said that while he understands that impulse, he also believes it's important to encourage people to seek information from diverse sources, not just from entertainment figures. Joy responded with a small laugh, acknowledging that as someone who works in television, she's part of that same system. She said that maybe the real challenge is finding a balance between using one's voice and knowing when to step back. By this point, the atmosphere in the studio had noticeably softened. The earlier tension hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had evolved into something more reflective and conversational. The hosts were no longer pushing against each other's viewpoints as strongly, and Renner appeared more relaxed again, his posture less rigid, his tone more open. The The audience seemed engaged in a quieter way now, listening rather than reacting. There were fewer bursts of applause, but more attentive silence, the kind that suggests people are genuinely thinking about what's being said. As the segment began to wrap up, one of the hosts thanked Renner for being candid and for participating in what she described as an important conversation. Renner responded by saying that he appreciates the opportunity to talk about these things in a respectful environment, even when there are disagreements. Joy smiled and added that disagreements are part of what makes these discussions meaningful, especially when they're handled with honesty and mutual respect. There was no apology, no dramatic reconciliation, just a shared acknowledgement that the conversation had been challenging but worthwhile. For viewers watching at home, the exchange likely stood out not because it was loud or explosive, but because it felt genuine. It reflected a kind of real-world tension that many people experience in their own conversations about expectations, influence, and the pressure to take positions on complex issues. By the time the show moved on to the next guest, the moment between Renner and Joy had already begun circulating in people's minds. It wasn't framed as a conflict in the traditional sense, but it was clearly one of those live television moments where something unscripted and slightly uncomfortable reveals deeper questions beneath the surface. As the broadcast continued, the producers allowed the conversation to breathe a little before moving fully into the next scheduled segment. There was a short commercial break, and when the show returned, the energy felt steadier but still reflective. For viewers watching live, it was clear that the earlier exchange had left a subtle imprint on the rest of the episode. When Jeremy Renner reappeared on screen after the break, the hosts briefly reintroduced him, as is common in daytime television, especially when a discussion runs longer than expected. The tone was friendly, but more subdued than at the start of the interview. The panelists seemed more aware now that anything they asked could easily steer back into the broader conversation about public responsibility and influence. One of the hosts shifted the focus toward Renner's recent projects again, asking about how he chooses roles at this stage in his career. It was a deliberate attempt to bring the conversation back to familiar ground. Renner responded comfortably, explaining that he's become more selective, prioritizing stories that resonate personally rather than purely professionally. However, even this topic carried an undertone connected to the earlier discussion. He spoke about wanting his work to feel meaningful, not just visible. He said that after everything he's experienced, he's more interested in depth than exposure. Joy listened attentively, nodding as he spoke. When she responded, her tone was noticeably softer than earlier. She said that she can understand that perspective, especially after major life experiences that change how someone sees success and relevance. Renner agreed, adding that personal growth often comes with a reassessment of priorities. He said that fame can feel overwhelming if it's not grounded in something real, and that he's tried to stay connected to what feels authentic to him. At this point, the conversation had clearly shifted away from direct disagreement, but the underlying themes remained. The hosts weren't challenging him anymore, but they were still exploring the same ideas from different angles. One of the co-hosts asked how Renner deals with public perception, especially when headlines or social media discussions misinterpret his intentions. This question seemed to naturally link back to the earlier exchange without directly reopening it. Renner responded thoughtfully, saying that he's learned not to react immediately to every narrative that forms around him. He explained that public perception is often shaped by fragments of conversations or out-of-context quotes, and that trying to control it can be exhausting. The audience reacted with light laughter when he mentioned how quickly a single comment can turn into a trending topic. It was a moment of shared recognition, something many people in the room could relate to, even if on a smaller scale. Joy added that this is one of the biggest challenges in modern media, where conversations are rarely allowed to exist in full context. She said that people often respond to headlines rather than listening to the complete discussion. Renner nodded, agreeing that nuance is frequently lost. He said that this is another reason he prefers to keep certain conversations private or limited, because once something is public, it can be reshaped in ways that don't reflect what was actually meant. There was a brief silence after he said this, not awkward, but contemplative. The host seemed to absorb the point, and the audience remained quiet, listening. One of the other panelists then commented that what they had just experienced on air was a good example of how respectful disagreement can still be productive. She said that even though there were different viewpoints, the conversation never became hostile or dismissive. Joy acknowledged this, saying that she values being able to have open discussions, even when people don't fully agree. She admitted that sometimes her questions come from curiosity rather than a desire to challenge. Renner smiled at that, saying that he never felt personally attacked, just engaged in a conversation that required honesty. He said that he appreciates being asked thoughtful questions, even when they're uncomfortable. This exchange seemed to mark a subtle turning point. The earlier tension had transformed into a sense of mutual respect. There was no longer a sense of pushing back or defending positions, but rather a shared recognition of complexity. The conversation then moved toward audience questions, a common feature in these kinds of segments. One viewer asked about how Renner stays grounded despite constant public attention. He answered by talking about family, routine, and the importance of having people around him who treat him normally. Joy responded by saying that staying grounded is probably one of the most important things for anyone in the public eye, especially in an environment where opinions and expectations are constantly projected onto you. Renner agreed, adding that grounding isn't just about personal well-being, but also about maintaining perspective. He said that it helps him remember that his experiences are just one small part of a much larger world. The audience reacted with gentle applause, signaling appreciation for the sincerity of his response. The atmosphere in the studio felt calm and reflective, far removed from the initial sense of tension. As the segment continued, it became clear that the earlier disagreement had actually set the tone for a deeper, more thoughtful conversation overall. Instead of derailing the interview, it had shifted it into a more meaningful direction. Joy made a final comment before the segment ended, saying that she thinks these kinds of discussions are valuable precisely because they don't always lead to clear answers. She said that sometimes the goal isn't to agree, but to understand different perspectives. Renner agreed, saying that understanding is often more productive than persuasion. He said that he doesn't expect everyone to see things the way he does, and that he's still learning himself. For viewers, this part of the segment likely felt like a resolution, not in the sense of settling a disagreement, but in showing how two different viewpoints can coexist without conflict. The conversation had moved from tension to reflection, from challenge to mutual acknowledgement. As the show prepared to transition to the next guest, the hosts thanked Renner again for his openness and for contributing to what had become one of the more substantive conversations of the episode. Renner thanked them in return, saying that he enjoyed the discussion and appreciated the respectful environment. When the camera finally shifted away, the studio audience applauded, not loudly, but warmly, as if recognizing that they had just witnessed something slightly more meaningful than a standard promotional interview. For many viewers, the moment stood out not because it was dramatic, but because it reflected a real-life dynamic that feels increasingly common. Conversations where people are trying to navigate expectations, influence, and personal boundaries in a world that constantly demands opinions. As the show went on, the earlier exchange between Jeremy Renner and Joy Behar continued to linger in a subtle way, even as the program moved through its usual structure. The conversation had settled into a calmer rhythm, but there was still a sense that something meaningful had happened, something that viewers were quietly carrying with them as they watched the rest of the episode unfold. When the hosts returned after another short break, they briefly referenced the discussion without directly revisiting it. One of them commented on how refreshing it was to hear a guest speak honestly about personal boundaries and public expectations. It was framed as a general observation, but it was clear to anyone watching that this was a reflection on the earlier moment. Renner remained on set for a few more minutes, as sometimes happens when a guest segment blends into broader discussion. The tone was now noticeably lighter, but not shallow. There was an ease in the way the hosts addressed him, and he appeared more relaxed, sitting back in his chair, his hands resting comfortably in his lap. One of the co-hosts asked him about how he manages interviews in general, especially when they move into sensitive territory. She said that from the outside, it can look effortless, but that it must take a lot of emotional awareness to navigate those situations in real time. Renner responded by saying that it's something he's learned over the years. Early in his career, he admitted, he used to feel the need to answer everything quickly and perfectly. Now, he's more comfortable with taking a moment to think before speaking, or even choosing not to answer certain questions if they don't feel right. The audience reacted with a soft ripple of laughter when he said that sometimes the best response is simply to pause. It was one of those understated moments that felt relatable to many people watching, especially those who've experienced the pressure of being put on the spot. Joy listened and nodded, then added that pausing is something people in media often struggle with, because silence on television can feel uncomfortable. She said that there's a constant pressure to fill every moment with words, even when reflection might be more appropriate. Renner agreed, saying that silence isn't always a sign of uncertainty, but sometimes a sign of respect for the complexity of a topic. He explained that he's become more aware of how easily conversations can become performative, especially in public spaces. This comment seemed to resonate with the panel. One of the hosts remarked that modern audiences are more perceptive than they're often given credit for, and that viewers can usually tell when someone is speaking from genuine experience versus when they're simply repeating expected lines. Joy responded by saying that this is why she values honest disagreement, even when it feels uncomfortable. She said that conversations lose meaning when everyone tries too hard to sound agreeable or safe. Renner smiled slightly and said that he appreciates that approach, even if it puts him in challenging positions at times. He added that he'd rather have a thoughtful conversation than a perfectly smooth one. By this point, the earlier tension had fully transformed into something closer to mutual understanding. The dynamic between Renner and Joy felt less like a push and pull, and more like two people acknowledging that they come from different perspectives but are willing to listen. The studio audience seemed to sense this shift as well. Their reactions were quieter but more engaged, with fewer loud bursts of applause and more attentive silence. It was the kind of atmosphere that suggests people are listening closely rather than waiting to be entertained. One of the final questions directed at Renner came from another host, who asked how he hopes audiences perceive him after interviews like this. She wondered whether he feels pressure to leave a certain impression, or whether he's comfortable letting people interpret his words however they choose. Renner answered honestly, saying that he used to care a lot about how he came across, but that over time he's learned to let go of that need for control. He said that as long as he's being sincere, he's comfortable with the idea that different people will take different things from what he says. Joy responded by saying that sincerity is probably the most important quality a public figure can offer, even if it doesn't always align with everyone's expectations. She added that viewers are often more forgiving of disagreement than people assume, as long as they feel respected. Renner nodded and said that respect is key, both for the audience and for the people you're speaking with. He said that he never wants a conversation to feel like a performance or a confrontation, but rather an exchange. This exchange felt like a quiet resolution, not in the sense of settling a debate, but in acknowledging that the earlier disagreement had led to something constructive. The tone of the segment was now reflective, almost meditative, compared to the lively energy at the start of the show. As the hosts began to wrap up Renner's appearance, they thanked him again for his openness and for being willing to engage in a discussion that went beyond the usual promotional format. Renner thanked them in return, saying that he appreciated the chance to speak honestly and to be part of a real conversation. The audience applauded warmly, and the camera lingered for a moment on Renner shaking hands with the hosts before transitioning to the next part of the show. For viewers watching at home, this part of the episode likely felt like a natural cooling down period after the earlier tension. The disagreement had not escalated into anything dramatic, but it had clearly influenced the mood and direction of the segment. What stood out most was not what either side had won or lost, but how the conversation had evolved. It had started with a simple question, moved into a subtle disagreement, and then gradually shifted into a broader reflection on communication, expectations, and authenticity in public life. In many ways, this is exactly how real daytime television works when it's at its most genuine. Moments of tension arise not from conflict for the sake of drama, but from honest differences in perspective that unfold live, without scripts or rehearsed outcomes. And for an audience accustomed to polished soundbites and predictable interviews, watching a conversation develop organically, even with moments of discomfort, can feel unexpectedly engaging, not because it's sensational, but because it feels real. As the segment finally came to a close, the show transitioned smoothly into its next scheduled topic, but for many viewers, the moment between Jeremy Renner and Joy Behar remained the most memorable part of the episode. There was no dramatic sign-off or explicit reference to what had just happened, but the shift in tone was noticeable. The energy in the studio felt calmer, more reflective, as if both the hosts and the audience were still processing the conversation. The immediate studio reaction was warm but subdued. The applause that followed Renner's departure wasn't loud or celebratory in the usual daytime television way. Instead, it felt more like an acknowledgement of something meaningful, a recognition that the conversation had gone beyond surface-level promotion and into territory that felt more personal and real. As the cameras moved on, the hosts briefly exchanged light comments to reset the mood, something they often do after heavier discussions. There was a short moment of casual banter, a few smiles, and then the show continued as planned. On the surface, everything returned to normal, but the earlier exchange lingered in a subtle way, both in the studio and for viewers watching at home. Almost immediately after the episode aired, clips of the conversation began circulating online. Short segments were shared across social media platforms, usually focusing on the key moments where Renner pushed back on the idea of public obligation and emphasized personal boundaries. These clips weren't framed as confrontations, but as thoughtful exchanges, often accompanied by captions highlighting the calm but firm tone of his responses. Viewer reactions were mixed but largely respectful. Some people praised Renner for speaking honestly and for not giving a rehearsed or politically convenient answer. They appreciated his emphasis on authenticity and his willingness to acknowledge uncertainty rather than perform confidence. Many comments described his approach as refreshing, especially in a media environment where public figures are often expected to have immediate opinions on everything. Others sided more with Joy's perspective, arguing that visibility comes with responsibility and that influential voices can make a difference by engaging in public discussions. These viewers felt that her questions were fair and reflective of a broader concern about the role of celebrities in shaping social narratives. What stood out most in the online conversation wasn't division, but nuance. Instead of polarizing reactions, many viewers acknowledged that both sides had valid points. People discussed the complexity of influence, the pressure placed on public figures, and the difficulty of navigating expectations in a highly visible world. Several media outlets picked up the story, not as a controversy, but as an example of a meaningful on-air discussion. Headlines focused on the respectful nature of the exchange rather than framing it as a clash. Analysts and commentators noted how rare it is for daytime television to allow space for genuine disagreement without turning it into spectacle. In follow-up interviews and commentary, some of the hosts reflected briefly on the moment. They described it as a good example of why live television can be powerful, because it allows conversations to unfold naturally, without scripts or predetermined outcomes. Joy herself later mentioned that she appreciated Renner's honesty, and that she values conversations where different perspectives can coexist without hostility. Renner, when asked about the exchange in later interviews, didn't describe it as a disagreement at all. He referred to it as a conversation and said that he enjoyed being part of a discussion that felt real. He emphasized that he never felt uncomfortable or attacked, and that he appreciated the chance to explain his perspective in a respectful environment. From a broader perspective, the moment resonated because it reflected something many people experience in their own lives. The tension between speaking out and staying silent, between influence and authenticity, is not unique to celebrities. It's a common dilemma in everyday conversations, especially in a world where opinions are constantly shared and evaluated. What made the segment stand out wasn't the presence of conflict, but the absence of theatrics. There were no raised voices, no dramatic interruptions, no viral one-liners designed to provoke outrage. Instead, there was a slow, natural unfolding of differing viewpoints, handled with patience and mutual respect. For regular viewers of daytime talk shows, this kind of moment is rare but memorable. It's the kind of exchange that doesn't dominate headlines for weeks, but stays with people because it feels honest. It reminds audiences that not every meaningful television moment has to be loud or sensational. In the days following the episode, discussions continued online, with viewers sharing their own experiences of feeling pressured to speak or stay silent in different situations. Some talked about workplace dynamics, others about family conversations, and many about the challenge of expressing opinions in public spaces without fear of misinterpretation.